Thank you for being here. We are getting now to the sort of heart of the talks, like the previous conversation sort of led us to. It's a pleasure to host this gallery talk because there is this constant sort of idea and concern about labeling, and that conversation has had also run through the conversations, the discussions that we've been having since yesterday. And it's a general topic since the idea of emergence of contemporary African art. And I wanted to have two representatives in the American space who deal with contemporary African artists to give us an insight into their work. Is it the cultural specific dealing? Is it a different dealing? And what does it take to promote contemporary African artists to a market, the US market, which is quite, I like to try to use light words, but it's not always easy, but quite segregated in a certain way. We have to admit it. And I'm very happy to have Lisa Brittan from Axis Gallery. I will not introduce her any further than someone who has been establishing, and Smooth will do it better. And Mariane Ibrahim from EVA Gallery in Seattle, who will tell us about their business, about their passions, and about maybe also the contradictions that they may encounter in their work.
Thank you, Koyo. So I will go on to introduce our two esteemed speakers, after which they'll have 10 minutes per person to talk about their galleries, their work, their practice as gallerists, and then we begin to do the questions justice. So Lisa Brittan is South African born. She studied fine arts and art history and sociology, specializing in graphics and photography. She was part of the resistance art movement, the anti-apartheid movement from 1986 to 89, and then she went into exile. Did you fled into exile or what? She left South Africa, sorry, in Zimbabwe. In 1989, she moved to New York and became a producer on the award-winning weekly PBS news magazine, South Africa Now. She also directed numerous TV programs on African arts, music, and culture for American and South African broadcasts. She won the award for Best Documentary Film at the Cannes Midem Festival for her film on South African music, including its global reach and American influence, titled We've Got the Power. She co-founded Axis Gallery in New York City in 1997, and she continues to direct the gallery today, together with her partner, Curator Gary Van Wyk. The New York Times critic Holland Cotter said that Axis Gallery made New York history by putting African art, old and new, on the map in Chelsea. So today she's going to talk about the gallery's evolution in the context of New York and America. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Smooth.
Well, let me quickly introduce Marian, and then you go. Yeah. So Mariane Ibrahim-Lenhardt is a curator and entrepreneur. She founded the Mariane Ibrahim Gallery, formerly the MIA Gallery in Seattle in 2012. She's originally from Somalia, and she's lived on 3 different continents: Africa, Europe, and North America. Her interest on emerging contemporary. Her interest in emerging contemporary art is heavily influenced by experiences and observations of the world around her. She has a background in media, communication, and advertising, and has worked in a variety of international sectors. In the early 2000s, she played a vital role in attaining UNESCO recognition of Somali rock art and cave paintings as an important cultural monument. From France, she moved to Seattle and continues to pursue a career in the field of art and culture, and opened a gallery with a solo exhibition of the Malian photographer Malik Sidibe, which I'm sure a lot of us know. And she has followed that with numerous exhibitions for artists of African descent, but also artists from elsewhere. You're welcome, Mariane. So I'll hand it over to Lisa.
So myself and Gary van Veek started Access Gallery in '97, as you heard. We essentially started the gallery in Chelsea, before Chelsea had many galleries at all. The focus of the gallery initially was on historical material. And one of the things that we set out to do was to challenge ideas about how people viewed African art, and to challenge the stereotypes of sculpture and figuration in Africa, and actually profile women's art, beadwork, lesser known art forms. But because we came out of this contemporary art movement, contemporary South African resistance movement, we were engaged in street art, and we came out of art school, we were also very connected to the artists in South Africa. So, as a logical extension, I guess that was my first slide of the historical material. And as a result of that, we decided we would launch into representing many of the people that we knew as friends. It just made logical sense. So the first group show that we presented was in 1999. We put out an open call for artists in South Africa to present postcard-sized works for a show called Postcards from South Africa, to take the temperature of the South African landscape just post-liberation, so in 99. And some of the people, it was a show of about 175 works, and by 80 artists, and some of whom have gone on to become really prominent. Mustafa Maluka on the left and Senzeni Marasela on the right. In fact, you know, it was a show that gave a very broad perspective on contemporary art and at the time. And later that year, in fact, Harlan Cotter said at the time that he would have liked a more specific show really to focus on contemporary African art that was quite broad, and there was really a need at that time for that. But we, having mounted this very, you know, new show, because of the boycotts, people didn't really know a lot about South African art, and we fully supported those boycotts. But really our mission was to begin to educate American audiences about specifically South African art, because that was our area, and museums to begin to include this material in their own collections. And late that year, the Museum for African Art mounted the first focused exhibition called Liberated Voices on South African art. And so we always considered ourselves a kind of supplement, something that would trigger the next moment. We liked to challenge notions and present things somewhat ahead of the curve. So artists that we began to represent were people like, Sue Williamson, whose work you see above dealt with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's called Can't Forget, Can't Remember, and it's currently in the National Museum for African Art. And she uses text and audio and video to interrogate that space of reconciliation. And Sue, literally wrote the book on resistance art in South Africa, which also profiled, sorry, I'm not doing this very well, profiled some of the guerrilla art that we were engaged with, which was really essentially just putting billboards up in the streets of Johannesburg, covering the violence, because at that time, it became illegal under the state of emergency to publish anything in the newspapers that represented the violence that was going on in the townships. So the government banned any kind of imagery. And then the newspapers, the more left-wing newspapers, The Guardian, etc., the Weekly Mail and Guardian, they started to print just white spaces where everything was redacted to show what had been censored. And then the government actually banned the white spaces. So we decided we would fill those white spaces with imagery replicating violence. And so we did numerous projects, late at night, profiling that violence. And then some of the other people that we represented at the time, William Kentridge, we showed Kentridge before people even knew who he was in New York. The New York audiences didn't know who William was, and it really was, I guess, at the beginning of his exposure. Also, Rutsani Namasitoni. Why am I having such trouble?
Let me help you.
Okay, Rutsani Namasitoni and Sam Nchlengetwa were two other artists that we worked with at the time. You can move on, Smooth. And then in 2001, we mounted a solo show for Bernie Searle. It was just actually after the 2001 Venice Biennale, where she was featured in the show Authentic Eccentric, which was actually it was curated by Salah Hassan and Olo Guibe, and it was actually really Africa's first collateral intervention into Venice. So she was a part of that. And so we mounted this solo show in Axis in September. And the opening date for the show was actually September 11th. Actually,
Can I go back?
you can go back one, if you want. So Bernie also, just to say, Bernie at the time was very concerned with issues of personal identity, the body, and looking at her roots. So she used spices in this installation called Straces to trace her body and literally trace her family history back to Mauritius as associated with the trade routes. Okay, Smooth, you can go on now. So September 11th hit in New York, and that was our opening date. And it was an intense time. And Bernie, at the time, we did this installation of hers called Still, where she essentially covers herself in flour and she gets engaged with the role of bread making. But in the context of 9/11, people actually did come, though we had cancelled the actual opening because of the mayhem in New York. People still came, and people who were supporters of the gallery came to the gallery, and we, lit candles and made it a space for people to come into. It was very interesting to see how a work that had a very different meaning got read in a very different way, because suddenly the flower got read as ash, and it took on a completely different significance because of the date that it was exhibited, and also because of the content, the context. Then other rather emotional shows that we did. This one was called Resistance Art in South Africa, and it covered the period from the 1976 riots with Simon Zima's image on the left, and we had 24 photographers in the show and about 65 images. And the exhibition, again, Holland said that it was a necessary complement to Akwi's short century show that was actually happening at PS1 at the same time. And then a decade later, Enwezor actually mounted his exhibition, The Rise and Fall of Apartheid, which revisited some of the material that we had profiled at that time. So, and actually, then these are just some images. That's the iconic Weinberg shot of Mandela voting in Natal, and TJ Lemon. Zuma behind. With Zuma behind, exactly. Yeah. So, and then let's see where we're at here. Okay, so we also, were interested in challenging ideas and contributing to the discourse in New York to challenge the way people read things. So there was a lot of debate about female genital mutilation in Africa. So we decided to mount a show on male circumcision and to enter the debates that occurred around those ideas. And we mounted this exhibition that included the work of Piet Pienaar, who was an Afrikaans man, artist, who decided to publicly have a circumcision in a gallery space in Cape Town, and was severely critiqued at the time by other people, specifically Xhosa-speaking artists, because they felt that it became a debate, a very large debate at the time. And so what we did is we juxtaposed Thembi Goniwe's work. If you can just go back one, smooth. Thembi Goniwe's work, because Thembi is an academic, an artist, and a critic, and he severely criticized Piet Pienaar for, being insensitive to Xhosa traditions of circumcision. So we put them together, and it just really created a dialogue, and also, raised questions in an American context about circumcision, because in the context of America, many circumcision occurs quite frequently. So those were ways of bringing these debates to the mind's eye of people in American audiences. And another two artists we had on the show were Kobet Mashile and Pro Sobopha. Pro Sobopha worked into Xhosa blankets and with charcoal. And Kobet Mashile actually spoke about his work and impacting him ever since he had had his circumcision. He found the work that he made cathartic. So this is some of the work that he produced in that regard. Excuse me. And then, I guess in 2004, about the time of the Republican convention under Giuliani in New York, which actually led to demonstrations and arrests in Manhattan, Access showed Clinton Fain. He's an activist artist from San Francisco, originally from South Africa. And his work had suffered a lot of censorship in the US. So he actually sued the Attorney General of the US, challenging their Communications Decency Act. And he went all the way to the Supreme Court and actually won. So he scored those First Amendment rights. And then, one of our things was always also an emphasis for us was to profile women artists as well. So in 2006, we staged the solo debuts for Jo Smale, who did a project collaborating with William Kentridge, and Liddell Moe. Liddell did these very large-scale concrete installations in the space. And then in 2007, the lease on our gallery space had come to an end. And it gave us a chance to sort of rethink our program. And by that point, we really felt that we had accomplished this mission of putting South African art on the map in New York. And there were other commercial galleries that had taken up South African artists. And so we decided that we would no longer exclusively show South African artists, and expanded beyond both Manhattan, moved out of our space in Manhattan and beyond South Africa. So then began to include artists from other parts of the world, as well, other parts of Africa too, or artists affiliated with Africa more broadly. So as the, I think you have to go back one. Okay. Okay. So then as the Manhattan art world rebounded somewhat in 2008, we opened a space on Dobbin Street in Brooklyn, and we did a solo show of Graham Williams's photography, specifically his Edge of Town series. And then on Dobbin Street, we also formed a not-for-profit organization that called Elma and Dobbin, that encourages intercontinental exchanges and residencies between Africa, the US, and Eastern Europe. And so this broadened our engagement with the world, really. And we did numerous have done residencies through Elma for Senzeni Maricela, Willem Boshoff, Hervé Yumbi, etc. And so having opened up this new method of exhibiting, we rented a storefront space in downtown Newark, which felt to us to be more interesting and cutting edge than Chelsea. It's, if any of you, I'm sure some of you have been there to that part of town, but it's also sort of had a rejuvenation occurring in the last few years. And we mounted a solo show of Senzeni Maricela's work. And then later, Hervé Yumbi from Cameroon, we did this installation of his entitled Totems to Haunt My Dreams. And so really, you know, leasing temporary spaces for exhibitions and participating in fairs allows us to focus on our mission and various projects. And today, the gallery, you know, a gallery can be open for business 24/7 on the internet and globally. So this increasing globalization and Africa's increasing integration has dissolved the separation of Africa, I think. And it's not, and not only as an art category. I think we're moving beyond this idea of, you know, an identifiable Africa. So for this fair, we curated a show titled Crossings around the themes of crossovers, intersections and boundaries, and done. I'm almost done. There's 2 more slides. And it's also linked to our current consciousness of these global confluences. So that's it. You can go downstairs and have a look at the work of Baloji, Mohan Lal, and Eke.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Over to you, Mariane.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll be very short because my history is a little shorter than Lisa. I started the gallery in 2012, called it MIA Gallery, which was a little bit confusing as it's really my name, Mariane Ibrahim Abdi. And I was sort of we started, my husband and I, as collectors. So we were buying art, and it was very difficult for me to find what I was sort of looking for, an alternative images of Africa. So I sort of decided to create the space so that I'm able to see the images that I have not been shown to. So, so I started my gallery in a very provincial city, Seattle, where the art scene is extremely local and for certain part non-existent. So here I have prepared a series of images. I will let you know when but we can start with this beautiful photo of Fabrice Montero. And so being in a very, a city that is not on the map on art in general, although it has a lot of collectors, I was wondering what would be a good strategy to sort of make an entrance to the art world. So I started with Malik Sidibé, and immediately it was sort of a buzz locally, as they would not have expected a very well-known photographer to be showing in Seattle. So I started with a solo show of Malik Sidibé, and then I carried on with artists for who the gallery was their sort of a first exhibitions. So I continued with different artists, Soli Cisse, Bruce Clark, Fabrice Montero, and other African-based or from the diaspora. But I was really, I didn't want to create a space where you could only find African artists, because it wouldn't have been extremely fair for my artists to only address to an audience who was only interested in contemporary African art. So I expanded from the first year to other countries. I have signed a contract with a young Iranian artist, Negar Farajani. Then it was working with another Dutch photographer, British, and it went on, Brazilian, Japanese, because I wanted to diversify and create a multicultural space. You can show. And so here I have created a series, you probably know the Sapeur, from Seattle. It was a sort of a rebellious, I was into a rebellious sort of a mood, because Seattle is known for being one of the less well-dressed cities in America. So I did a whole show of the Sapeur from Dundee, from Brazzaville. So each time I was doing an exhibition, it was in reaction to what Seattle was not exposed to. And you can go on. I will go artist by artist before. So this is a photograph from Fabrice Montero, where I have done a show called The Gorean Summer. Sort of a showing how joyful life can be in Africa. As I was raised also in Africa, in Somalia, my childhood looked more like this than what is being shown on TV right now, although the situation in Somalia is a particular case. But I wanted to show to the audience and also to my African contemporaries that, you know, this is our, not past, but this is our lifestyle. This is a photograph of Malik Sidibé as well. You can continue, I was doing just a... And this is the work of a really interesting photographer that generally take a lot of a space when I do art fairs, Maimouna Geresi. This year, she has a little space, as I have done a show at the Volta Fair. So Maimouna Geresi is a really interesting photographer, sculptor, and video installation artist. She is Italian-born, converted to Sufism, and is of Senegalese nationality. Maimuna's work is about empowering women's spirituality and also portraying African Sufism. So here is a diptych where she's confronting two characters, actually it's a brother and a sister, where there's a background of the African map with a cup where they're trying to have a piece of Africa. You can continue. This is a show that I have done, which was, I think, one of the most interesting show I have done as a sort of a group I've been only dedicating doing solo exhibitions. So I have done an exhibition called Power in Costumes. So I juxtaposed two artists, Fabrice Montero and Jim Norton. This is a photograph from the Hereros. And for those who probably don't know the Hereros, they are a tribe that has been almost exterminated by the Germans. And each time a Herero will kill a German person, he will wear their costume, and so the woman, they would wear the German missionary dressing. And I juxtaposed that with the Signard from Senegal to show in a situation of war how the woman react to the occupant and the dominator. So you can continue. And these are the Signard, who were actually the lawful wives of the colonizers and were extremely powerful as they had businesses, and also were celebrated for their beauty and man-like attitude. So that was really, for me, maybe as a woman, I was interested in exploring in the role of the woman in the position of occupation.
I'm sorry, did you say man-like attitude?
Yes. You can go for the next one. And this is a series of photos that was really touching for me, from a Sophie knife, where she went across different countries, portraying the children's dream and what they aspire to become. And we have here a young boy that has really touched me, where he wanted to be a journalist, and not having the costume of the journalist, draw himself the costume and took the attitude of a journalist. And that show I juxtaposed with the dreams of the children from Greenland, two extreme environmental, let's say, in very extreme environments where one is extremely cold and the other one is almost a desert. So this series was also interesting, as I did a show with the work of Justine Dinwall, in collaboration with a model, name is Tando Ando. And what I really liked about this exhibition was everybody in Seattle was telling me, oh, you only show African people. You only show black people. So I sort of told them, no, for the Black History Month, I promise I will show you white people. And they were very, very surprised. And I said, yeah, I swear, I'm not going to release any of the press. 1st of February, you will have only white people. And there was this beautiful woman, where I felt in staged in different ways, where she incarnated the Madonna, and knowing what's happening also for most of the albino community, I wanted to sort of show support in terms of, when we talk about Black history, we also forget about other minorities that also are being segregated. So that was my response to a lot of questions that I have been asked as a gallery owner. This is a recent artist that I could say, in love with. His name is Jim Shushu. He's in the audience and he's probably hiding himself. Jim Shushu is a filmmaker, and he has done recently a movie, documentary short movie that you have heard of, maybe Stories of Our Lives. And it's about the stories of, 3 stories of the LGBT community in Nairobi, which is not in a very easy position, as we know what is happening in Nairobi and Uganda. And his photographs have touched me because this series is called Pagans, and it's interested in exploring pre-Islamic and pre-Christian religions and creating a form of mythologies and black mythologies, and showing what has brought us to create so much discourse between all these religions that has been, in a way, imported to Africa. And you can see some of his images at my booth. And this is the work of Fabrice Montero. I mean, you probably think that I showed too many of Fabrice. Fabrice has done this series called Prophecies, and in collaboration with a fashion designer, Gal. And this is a series where he's going through environmental issues, and that is also another subject that really that is really important, because Africa is very much absent of the discussions on environmental issues. We're so much dealing with them in social, economic issue, but this is a series where Fabrice and a designer has started to create in order to bring some more sensibility. And ideally, he did this series in order to create stories for the children. So the education start from an early age, so that people are more and more aware and start to care for their own environment and habitat. And you can go. Yes, and we have the work of Soli Cissé, some collages. I'm sort of specialized on photography, but this is one exception where I'm showing painter, and you can continue. Yes, this is the work of an interesting one, Jean-Claude Moschetti. You will see some of his images. Jean-Claude has been working in Africa for the past 20 years. And he was mostly a photographer, documentary photographer. But that was not enough for him, so he decided to get initiated to the Egungun. The Egungun are a community, religious community based in Benin and Nigeria. And through his immersion, he could have access to costumes, was able to open a little window in order to show the richness of the costumes and staging them in a very architectural way. This is the work of Maimouna Geresi, again, who is also portraying women spirituality. And then it's finished. It's almost done. We're there. Same here. I'm very much into women and spirituality. This is another portrait from Fabrice Montero. Again, this is another artist, Scarlett Cotton, showing some vestige from the Egyptian culture, pharaoh culture, and yeah, go on. This is an interesting also artist, Kimiko Yoshida, Japanese, who sort of recreated herself into a Kyuku bride from Kenya. So I sort of mix all, I have different backgrounds, and sort of a staging exhibition where there's a lot of hybridity, and where Africa is everywhere, or African notion culture. Fabrice again, woman, and this is a very powerful images from Fabrice, where he recreated the conditions of slavery based on the book of the Code Noir, where he was able to get the layout and the design, where he had to struggle with institutions such as the Musée de Quai Branly and the libraries in France to be able to get the design, so that he's able to recreate the conditions of slavery. That was in Benin. This is the work of Ayanna Jackson that you will see. Ayanna Jackson is African American and sort of started to work in Johannesburg. She's also in here. Has been portraying herself into a sort of an anthropological survey of her body. And there's also a whole series that she did related to slavery. Yeah, and Ruby is also it's short. Ruby Onyenyeshi Amanze is a Nigerian artist, a drawer. You will see some of her images, of her drawings at the booth, and then you can go fast on those. Malik Sidibe, as you probably know, and then we're finishing with a kick with Bedouin Mwanda, a separate series.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a 2 or 3 prong question so that we sort of fast forward things. I mean, it's interesting to look at all the images, and it shows a diversity of media, of course, and understanding of the social imagination in the context of Africa in relation to the rest of the world. But I'm going to return to a question they posed at South Africa posed to you, and I think you can also answer the same question. The question was, is there anything like African art? So I'm reposing that question to you, sort of to get us started.
No.
Okay.
I would say no, because all I mean, how could we, the images that I have shown, how could we say that this is one image? And I didn't add the heavy metal guys from Botswana. But there are so many images, and I don't find myself in one. Being also from the outside and seeing how the society and how the technology are influencing our lifestyle, I cannot feel that there is only one type of African art.
Yeah, I'd say Africa is full of multiple identities, and much like the rest of the world, really.
But I mean, again, yeah, true, of course, but there's always certain value. I mean, there's certain values attached to the works of African artists, you know, and I wonder, I mean, of course, I wonder how you negotiate those values and how you also insist on the disavowal of the label African, you know, but the artwork insists on a certain value attached to the understanding, the way African artists, works by artists of African descent or works of artists of Africa are understood. So how do you negotiate that fault line between the values, the sort of contrived, if you will, or specific values attached to the understanding of the works of artists from Africa, and also the fact that one wants to disavow Africa as a sort of as a qualifying label attached to those artists. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that it's changed over time as well a lot, because I think that there was a time when, you know, it made sense to represent artists from Africa before there was really much understanding of contemporary African art. So there was a time where it was relevant. But I do feel that we're beyond that now. I feel that artists are informed by the environment, obviously, but I don't think that artists from Africa are any, you know, more or less informed by their environment than artists in America. And I don't know that there's a common value for all of Africa. I think that it's a personal value that certain artists attach. I mean, I know that certainly when we were representing South African artists, many of our contemporary artists didn't like to be pigeonholed as such. You know, it's definitely, and that was understandable. But for American audiences who knew very little about what that was, it was kind of a process, in a way, of educating your audience to think beyond those ideas, to think beyond those categorizations, and to move beyond those ideas, you know, of African value. What is an African value, really?
It's not really African value, but there's a certain kind of value. I mean, there's certain values attached to, I mean, if you ask me, for example, I'm called the African curator, you know, for example, you know, or the curator of African arts.
Well, those qualifiers shouldn't really exist anymore,
Okay.
as far as I'm concerned.
But I mean, those qualifiers exist because they serve a purpose.
Yes.
And I wonder how galleries, I mean, your gallery, negotiate the purpose those labels serve. That's really my question, given the context in which your gallery exists, you know.
Well, I'm very lucky because I'm African and dealing with African art, so it's all mixing, you know. I'm very proud to call my artists African. I'm African, and that's what they are, as I call the other ones European, Brazilian, and so on. But I find sometimes the word disturbing because it is associated with different forms of art. When we talk about contemporary art, and then we use the label African contemporary art, everyone sort of have a sort of a connection to either craft or some traditional arts as well. So the contemporary, this is why in my position, in my gallery, it is interesting to mix all the artists and just to have like, okay, they're all contemporary artists. One is from Africa, one is from there. And I'm constantly asked directly, because I'm African, that obviously I know African arts because I am African. A lot of things are very new to me, and I rely on curators. And I think that the work of the curators are also there to impose a new label, because we are at the end business and trying to create a commercial value for the artists to continue to live from their work, and also continue to progress. And I'm very happy today to see that there are more and more African collectors buying from African artists, and that the relation is not going necessarily from south to north, but south to south. And I really feel extremely optimistic in the future of those artists being able to create their own label, that the one that they have been dictated.
You want to say something? Or?
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, I'm also an African, and so whatever I do is, in a way, a kind of insider perspective. And I come out of that world, and so it feels like a world that I have some understanding of. And it is kind of specific because Africa is a big place. And I'm also proud to represent art from the region. It's something that I think deserved exposure, or I wouldn't have had the mission that we wouldn't have had the mission we had in our gallery. I think it's hard to negotiate in a way, reinforcing the framework without pigeonholing it. And you can always fall between those two stools, but I don't think that we should be limited by those frameworks. I think we have to, be able to think outside of it and within it, really.
So I guess my next question will be, what were the initial challenges for you, as well as ongoing challenges in negotiating those pigeonholes and framework as a gallerist,
Well, I mean, in the New York art world, Africa is just another ethnicity in a way. As we all know, it's a melting pot. So it was a focus for us because that was our area of specialization and expertise. But at the same time, people could walk down the road and go and visit a gallery specialized in
Asian
Japanese art or Chinese or not, just broadly contemporary American art. So it was just another focus, another space. And our idea was to bring that space to American audiences and to get that work into American institutions so that the public was exposed to it, really. And that's an ongoing challenge, but it has changed enormously. In the 18 years that I have been in this world, it's really opened up so enormously, and people are far more educated about Africa and contemporary art and all of these things than they were 18 years ago.
But then, one of the things, you want to respond to that? Well, my next question goes to you, actually. You said...
To me?
No, it goes to Marian, yeah.
Okay.
You said, Japanese art, there are other kinds of ethnic art, but what is quite interesting in the ways ethnicity is constructed around contemporary art is you have African art. You don't have, say, Nigerian art. You don't. Having a specific purchase in the international art system, you have the entire continent as one entity represented as African art. But then you mentioned Japanese art, you mentioned Chinese art, Indian art, and I wonder how how, as gallerists, you would, Marian, you would want to engage with that conundrum.
Yeah, you're completely right. We always talk about, but we also say the Middle East. We also say the Islamic. I guess there is not today. We talk about Nigerian artists and so on, but to the public, it's all one Africa, and even Africa stops because they have like the Maghreb artist and the South Africans. It's the South African, and there's the rest of Africa. It's really a question of education. I'm doing that almost 24 hours a day in Seattle. Okay. So New York is a little bit closer to Africa, but my Seattle is, they have a telescope that is overlooking New York, overlooking Africa. So I tend to break with that sort of a language, and mostly focus on, okay, Fabrice, where is he? Fabrice Montero, should I say that where he's from, where he works? The other artists, Maimouna Geresi, even though she's born Italian, she will tell the world she's Senegalese. So sometimes it's interesting, the interaction that collectors or public have with me in relation with my artists, where they cannot sort of understand why she can be Senegalese and why I can be French. So, so I try to really not raise all of these questions, but really, really focus on serving the voices of the artists and making sure that any sort of a prejudgment that every person could have, I kind of counter that. And the work of working with curators and museums have helped me a lot in making and in expanding myself, and also making sure that my artists are really valued for the work than the label than coming from, you know, sort of Africa.
I'm going to ask one last question, then I'll throw it to the audience. So it was the art historian Chika Okekagul who said African artists have come to the dinner table, invited or not. You know, this is to say that there's sort of a hype about contemporary African art, and my question is, is there really a hype? As galleries, do you think there's really a hype about contemporary African art?
Don't believe the hype. No, I think that it has grown enormously. You talk about contemporary African. I think it has. I think it is a growing. It's a growing market, and you know, it's expanded. Whether it's a hype, I'm not sure, but it's definitely growing, and it's become much broader than it ever was, and it's expanding. I mean, you know, the whole sort of the focus on Das Kapital and our current Venice Biennale. I mean, we're talking about the ownership of means of production, right? About class, about those issues, and so Africans have taken that ownership, and they're doing it, and it's expanding, and so I think that's a good thing.
Mariane?
I would say it's a hype, and we have to make it as a hype. We are not have something that will go up and then fall. And this is where I'm really invested in sort of a mission where, as an African person, I have to keep going and go through that. Because otherwise we will be, you know, defined. So I think it is growing, it's expanding, and what's happening in Venice, it's also propelling the African or African diaspora, African American artists, because there's also the African American that has also been very much more established here, and Okwe beautifully connected the African with the African American. But I think we have to make it a hype. It has the magazines. They have to be fairs, general fairs, where you rarely see those mainstream fairs. You rarely see galleries who are either from Africa or showing a lot of African, I'm not talking about one, but more African artists. So we have to be, you know, we have to expand, we have to be everywhere, we have to be all over the place.
Okay. So it's safe to say that both galleries will benefit from Okwe's Venice Biennial.
Well,
I'll turn to the
sure.
audience. All right, questions from the audience?
Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that a gallery sort of has the ability to open a space for political identity to be brought to the public and kind of reimagine the way we conceive it. Would you say that the burden of the gallery in transacting these political identity ends in just presenting this, or does the gallery have an additional burden when you're working exclusively with an identity?
You mean, do you have a burden of representing Africa more broadly than representing the artists that you are working with?
Yes.
Well, I think it depends on the work that you're representing, really. You know, I think that, for example, with an artist like Sami Baloji, his work is so connected to Katanga and to the DRC that you can't fully represent him without representing the context, actually. So I think it's both. You have to, you know, tap into the artist and the work and give a broader understanding to people so they have insight, perhaps, or so yes, I think you do have a broader responsibility than simply just, you know, reading it through the artist. But, you know, the role of a gallerist is also to take it a step further, to curate, to encourage these dialogues, to have serious ideas, and to push the conversation further, I think, than simply just representing artists. You know, it gives it a context, I think. It's the life of the mind.
That's what I do all the time. So I do have to constantly, I mean, beside the beauty of the work and the meaning behind, have to sort of engage with the public of different issues. So for me, it's really important that they get the right message of the art that I'm showing. But it's not like I'm a sort of a humanitarian organization. It's the work has aesthetic, has depth, and so for me, every single time I have to also be ready to receive these remarks and observation and educate and explain them what this work stands and what is the context.
Thank you both. It was very interesting. This question is directed at Mariane in particular. Given that you're, I mean, I'm just saying, relatively young, a woman and of African descent, and we don't see many gallerists like you, and I think it's admirable that you've done what you've done. How would you sum up the challenges that you faced, both commercially and creatively, having, you know, set up a few years ago, quite recently? I'm very curious to learn about that, if you don't mind sharing some thoughts with us.
It was a long journey, and short and intense. So I sort of had ideas where I wanted to go, and the fact that I didn't want to be sort of a labeled only African art gallery. I started to focus on institutions. Started to work with curators from museums and having a sort of, let's say, a validation among them. And gradually, as they have been showing a lot of support, they had me reach out, they had me translate what I was trying to do as a commercial gallery. But beside that, I will say that the aesthetic of the artists that I have been presenting were actually becoming a hype. So I got extremely privileged to have been working and to still be working with artists that have received great press, prizes. Today I'm working with numerous institutions, the Seattle Art Museum, the LACMA, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, because I am trying to present work from the contemporary African art that they wouldn't normally find in America as easier as they would find in other places. So I would say being remote and being in my provincial city was the greatest advantage for the way the gallery has been working.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say something about the word hype, if I can. Okay, I don't like that word because I think it kind of undermines the seriousness of the discourse. You know, it makes it seem like it's trivial, that there's a focus that is occurring, and hype is kind of something that rises and falls. And I kind of hope that that's not where we're at, really. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was a question, you know.
Yeah.
So I was expecting you. I was expecting to elicit a response.
Okay.
Can we just take one more question from the audience? He's been raising his hand. Just one more question, then that'll be it.
No, there is a next conversation that will pick up some of the topics that are being raised here. And I think that we have to, I really invite you to stay for this book launch because we have the pleasure to introduce that catalog, and two of the artists that participated to that in this exhibition are here. And all these questions of, the labeling, the hyping will also be taken into that conversation. But yes.
Well, on that note, thank you, and thank you.
Okay.